Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 154 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, we're diving into innovative education models with Kerry McDonald. Kerry works to spotlight and support education entrepreneurs who are building innovative K through 12 learning models and expanding education options for families. She's the host of the twice weekly Liberated podcast and the author of several books, including Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. Carrie is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and the Valinda Johnson Family Education Fellow at State Policy Network. In addition to her regular columns at Forbes and the 74, Carrie's articles have appeared at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, NPR, Newsweek, among many other publications. She has a BA in economics from Bowdoin College and a master's degree in education policy from Harvard. Carrie lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her husband and 4 children who have been always been, I should say, unconventionally educated. So I hope you'll stay tuned as we explore some of these alternative education models that are reshaping education. So with all that said, Carrie, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So as I was just briefly introducing myself pre-show, I indicated that I'm an attorney. I'm a firearms instructor. I'm also a husband, and my wife and I have a 9-month-old son. So this is a topic that's been at the top of my mind for a little while, and something that we'll be going through in terms of decision making in the not too distant future. And I think a lot of folks, when they think about education, most people think there's, public school, there's private school, and there's homeschool. And that's the only 3 options on the menu. And so what I love about what you're doing is that, yeah, you talk about those things some, but you also talk about a lot of these other very innovative education models more broadly. So if you would tell us what we mean, or what you mean by that when we're talking about innovative education models.
Well, I think there's a couple things to say first. I'll just start with some statistics that sort of shows where we're at in terms of education, and then go into more specifically to answer your question about innovative education. So, the latest data around education choices that families are making finds that about 6% of the overall school-age K-12 population in the U.S. are homeschooled. That's over 3.5 million students. About 7% of U.S. students are attending a charter school, which is a tuition-free public school, but typically privately run by usually a nonprofit organization. And families are choosing selecting into those schools, so they're not assigned to a school residentially by their zip code the way they are with conventional district schools. That's charter schools. Private schools, about 9% of overall school-age population is enrolled in a private school in the U.S. And then if you add in some of the other sort of public choice models around magnet schools, or what's sort of known as open enrollment, meaning families are able to choose a school that's outside of their zip code, outside of the school to which they're assigned, then there's even more choice. So we're talking conservatively about 1 in 5 students attending a school that they're not residentially zoned for. And again, if we add in some of these other public choice models, it's more like a quarter. And then within sort of homeschooling and charter schooling and private schooling, there's a lot of innovation happening. Again, as we kind of move education beyond the government-controlled realm. So what we're seeing there is a lot of where I spend my time. We're seeing the growth, obviously, in independent homeschooling since COVID, up 50% since pre-COVID levels. We see some states where homeschooling rates are continuing to accelerate. In fact, the Johns Hopkins Homeschool Hub that just launched earlier this year to sort of kind of gather information around homeschooling rates across the country has just reported that in the out of the 21 states that have reported homeschooling data, many states don't report any homeschooling data, but out of the 21 that have, 19 of those states saw increases from in 2023 compared to the year prior. And this is post-COVID, post-school shutdowns, post-remote learning, and we're still seeing homeschooling rates increase in recent years, which is just remarkable. In some states, like in Rhode Island, for example, that increase was about 67% in 2023 compared to 2022. North Dakota up 24% from the year prior. So just remarkable growth. The Washington Post calling homeschooling the fastest growing form of education in the U.S. last year. So we're seeing a lot of that. And then homeschooling, it can be what we would think of as sort of traditional homeschooling, which is families just, managing the education of their child individually. But more of what I'm seeing, and I think where so much of this growth is happening and where I think we'll continue to see growth, is in more of the sort of microschooling movement. And microschools, we've of course have known that homeschool co-ops and homeschool collaboratives have been around for a long time. Microschooling is sort of an updated version of that in some cases, where children are able to attend, an off-site program without their parents, having access to other instructors in their community, either full-time or part-time, at a fraction of the cost of a traditional private school, and with much more freedom and flexibility on the part of the parents to be able to really opt into a learning environment that is aligned with their personal values and preferences. So most of these microschools are sort of operating as homeschool programs, even though they could be full-time. But some are operating as recognized private schools. That often depends on kind of state regulations or the preferences of a founder of a microschool. And I will say that the vast majority, about 3/4 of the founders of these microschools, are former public school teachers who become disenchanted with what they're seeing in the public school system and decide they can do things better. And many of those are parents who are sort of motivated to make that change because they want something better for their own kids. So not only do they have that perspective as a public school teacher, but they're also a parent saying, I don't want my kid to be in that environment. I want to create something that's much more individualized, much more flexible, kind of, again, aligned with personal values and preferences. So it's a whole diversity of models and methods that are sprouting across the U.S. right now.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of that kind of cropping up in southern Indiana, where I'm from. I've seen also, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. I've seen also a lot of what are called cottage schools, where it's sort of a hybrid model of
Mm-hmm.
homeschool, but then the child will go to one of these cottage programs, maybe 2 or 3 days a week, and it's a sort of a hybrid between microschooling and the traditional homeschooling
Yeah,
model.
and microschool, I'll use as sort of a catch-all term that would include some of these, as you say, cottage schools or hybrid homeschool programs. Um, Again, they can be structured in different ways, either full-time or part-time, but it's kind of all under that same umbrella, which is why it's hard to know, how many of these, this increase in homeschooling is happening kind of in one home with one family, and how much of it is happening in more of the kind of microschool spaces. And I will just say, Alex, because I know you're in Indiana, Indiana is a perfect example of this. On my podcast recently, I had an Indiana homeschooling mom and microschool advocate, Jill Haskins, on my podcast. She's working with the National Microschooling Center, which is a national nonprofit trying to support and elevate microschooling across the country. And she's specifically focused on Indiana. When she started kind of counting microschools in Indiana back in 2023, she counted about 5. And now there are 80 within her network kind of supporting microschooling and homeschooling in Indiana, 30 of which just launched this academic year, this fall. And she expects, in Indiana alone, about 150 by next year. So just rapid growth in this space. these models and methods are very different, as you mentioned, sort of hybrid schools or 5-day-a-week schools, or school-like things. They're often, schooling alternatives. They're not necessarily traditional schools. But there's faith-based models, there's secular models, all kinds of different educational philosophies like classical and Montessori and unschooling and Waldorf and all kinds of things. So that I think what we're really starting to see in education finally and thankfully is much more personalization, choice, and variety, like we have in the rest of our lives, right? We have so much abundance and choice in every other area of our lives, but historically have not had that in education. And I think that's largely due to the fact that education has been within the realm and control of the government. We have compulsory education laws that mandate school attendance under a legal threat of force. And we have, again, residentially zoned schools to which you're required to attend unless you have families who can homeschool or pay tuition for private schools. And now we're starting to see more of these sort of financially accessible, innovative options. And I would just say one other thing about Indiana in particular that Jill mentioned to me is about 85% of the students in those now 80 microschools that she's counting in her network, 85% of the students are attending tuition free or nearly so due to Indiana's school choice policies.
And Indiana, for those who don't know, is among a number of other states who have really sort of pushed the school choice initiatives where the funding follows the child, and the parents have more autonomy, more choice about where those tax dollars are being spent. Of course, I understand in the libertarian circles there's lots of hesitancy about that, because it still leaves the government involved to some degree, but I think is nevertheless a step in the right direction. But one thing I'm curious about, and you alluded to this to some degree, you've seen an increase in these alternative education models in children attending these or taking advantage of these alternative education models post-pandemic. And I understand, a lot of folks weren't happy with the virtual learning that was going on in public schools and in many traditional school models during the pandemic. But what do you think is driving this continued trend? Is it just that parents saw what was going on in the schools during the pandemic and didn't like it, or is it something else? And I know it's not one reason necessarily. There may be a number of reasons, but you've spoken undoubtedly to many people who have defected from the public school or traditional school model. What would you say is continuing the drive, the trend toward these alternative educational models?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think what happened in the spring of 2020 when schools shut down and families switched to remote learning was sort of this default path of conventional government assigned district schooling was shaken. Right. So all of a sudden, parents had to kind of lift their head up and see not only what was happening in their children's classrooms that now they, in many cases, literally could see through Zoom school, but also it prompted them to start just thinking about other ways to approach education and wondering what else was out there. And I think this really began in earnest to occur in the summer of 2020 when we saw the rise of what were coined pandemic pods, which again were sort of like homeschool co-ops, right? It was parents spontaneously across the country realizing that their kids had been deprived of social interactions in most cases for the past several weeks or months, and there was the obvious recognition that schooling was likely not to go back to normal in most places in the fall of 2020. And so parents really had to take control of their children's education and start to come up with their own kind of grassroots solutions, which is why you saw these, again, informal, grassroots, spontaneous Facebook groups pop up to try to connect families to these pandemic pods, and families would take turns hosting students in their homes and maybe working through a curriculum, or in some cases hiring a teacher to lead a pod. And so that trend began again rapidly to expand in the summer of 2020. We also had a lot of those pods then turn into full-fledged microschools. In fact, the first guest that I had on my podcast back in February of 2022 was a former public school teacher in New Jersey, Jill Perez, who had been, at the time of COVID, working in higher education, training student teachers. And she was a mom of 4 kids who were displaced from their schooling environment. So she had to, again, like so many parents, take matters into her own hands, created a pandemic pod that 2020 to 2021 school year. And that turned into a full-fledged microschool that continues to flourish today, offering both full and part-time education options for homeschooling families in New Jersey. And so this has just been replicated across the country. And I think as these programs continue to build, more people find out about them. They're more open to innovative education options since COVID. There's all of these network effects that I think we're seeing play out, not only among founders and prospective founders of new schools and spaces who say, hey, that person's doing something cool. I think I can do this as well. And they become education entrepreneurs, but also among parents demanding new and different ways of approaching education, and seeing that there are these other options and wanting that in their community. So I think we're really just at the beginning of an acceleration towards much more sort of decentralized, choice-enabled, entrepreneur-driven educational models.
One thing that my perception is anyway, that is driving this continued move toward alternative education models is, I think that prior to the pandemic, a lot of parents thought, yeah, something might be an alternative might be better than the public school, but the public school is fine, and it would be difficult for us or impossible for us to do something else anyway. But now, not only are there so many more choices, I think people's eyes were opened during the pandemic that, wow, not only can we do this, but this is great for not only us, but our child. And how much of it do you think is driven by that sort of line of thinking?
Yeah, I think that again is sort of those network effects, is that
Mhm.
parents talk to each other, founders are creating these amazing spaces and trying to market them so that people know what they're offering. And then, those of us who were involved in homeschooling and microschooling, before 2020, my book Unschooled that you mentioned came out in 2019 and talked then about the growth and diversification of the homeschooling population and the advent of microschooling. Even then we were shouting about how joyful these learning spaces are, how kids can actually love learning, how they can be excited to grasp concepts, to go to a micro school. They were really just curious, energetic learners, and sort of the opposite of what we think of many kids today experiencing in conventional schools, where a lot of it is sort of drudgery or monotony. Certainly that was my experience. When I think back to my K to 12 public schooling experience, I think about what a waste of time so much of it was.
Yeah.
And I would have said I loved school, right? But now really seeing what true love of learning looks like in some of these unconventional educational environments, it just blows me away. And I think more and more families are realizing that not only should education be more joyful, be more sort of interest driven and self-directed and empowering for learners, but that that there are these spaces in these schools where that's possible, and they're, again, more financially accessible than ever before.
You wrote an article that was published. Actually, I think it was your newsletter, published through your newsletter first, but it's also available at fee.org. And it was called "What Do Good Schools Look Like?" It depends on what parents want. And I think
Mm.
so often people get caught up in sort of this rut, of thinking about schools and from the traditional sense. And there's so many options and opportunities out there. And you alluded to this a little bit. What are some of the practical benefits of these alternative education models? You alluded to sort of the drudgery of the public school, and I had the same experience, by the way. I was able to sort of navigate the game of public school and
Right.
succeed, whatever that means in that model. But could you talk a little bit about what defines what a good school looks like, and what are some of the practical benefits of these alternative education models?
Well, I guess I'll go back to say I can't define what a good school looks like, because as that piece that you reference alludes to, is that quality is in but the eyes of the beholder. If we think about the economic principle of subjective value, it's whatever value the the consumer is placing on something. So what I think of as, for example, a good cup of coffee might be different for you. I like Dunkin' Donuts. You might like boutique, highly imported, sort of niche coffee, right? And so we all have diverse preferences and needs. And I think historically in education, because education typically has taken place outside of a free market, we're not used to recognizing that there are and could be so many different ways of approaching education, and so many different ways of defining quality in that system. I will say that I think what makes a lot of these innovative education models exciting that I spotlight is they're just really focused on the individualized needs of each child. So instead of, for example, saying that all fourth graders should be doing this curriculum at this time in this way and failing them if they're not meeting those expectations, what I'm seeing much more of, again, in this kind of decentralized market-based microschooling movement is saying, okay, you're a fourth grader, maybe you're reading at an eighth grade level, but maybe you're doing math at a second grade level, and that's okay. We're going to target curriculum to meet you where you're at and make sure that you're actually mastering content before you're moving ahead. So instead of just sort of writing you off with your math skills as a fourth grader and saying, oh, well, looks like you might not be able to catch up, we'll say, no, we're going to get you caught up with a sort of individualized, much more kind of one-on-one or small group learning environment experience. And we're going to help you to master that content in different ways, maybe with different curriculum tools. So we're not just relying on a one-size-fits-all kind of top-down curriculum. And then if you're an exceptional reader, we're not going to make you read fourth grade books. We're going to connect you to books and content that's where your reading level's at to advance you there. So again, it seems so simple and it's so obvious in the rest of our lives where we just look at the apps on our phones or the other ways that we're able to make purchasing decisions in our lives. It's all individualized. And yet we don't historically have that same model in education until now.
One thing that always strikes me as odd is that you hear so much about diversity in sort of the public school and the traditional school setting, but yet the system treats every child the same. It doesn't recognize the different talents, aptitudes, abilities of the various children. And I think that's what's so amazing and so great about the alternative schooling methods or options is that you can find a school that fits your child's abilities, interests, needs, not just send them through the cookie cutter version that's provided by your local public school. And so I think that takes a lot of what we referred to earlier as the drudgery out of it. If there's a child, right, that loves to work with their hands, you may send them to a school that lets children work with their hands, right? And so I think that finding the school that fits your child's needs, or it may not be a school, it may be some hybrid model or homeschooling or what have you. But I think that creates so much opportunity for the child to maintain an optimistic outlook and to really fulfill their abilities.
I think that's completely right. And I think, you could even need something different or want something different for each child within a family, right? Maybe, one of your children will thrive in a forest school environment where they spend most of their time outside, getting dirty in the mud. And another child might want something that seems slightly more traditional. Maybe, they're wearing uniforms at a hybrid school or a classical microschool. And that's okay, right? That level of customization, kind of tailoring education to the needs of each child and the preferences and values of each family is, again, what makes this movement so exciting and why I think we're just at the early stages of it. I will also just add one other thing, Alex, I think is important. It's not only, I think, the kids, the students who are experiencing a lot of this drudgery in a conventional classroom. I think a lot of teachers are too, right? Teacher creativity is as stifled in a kind of one-size-fits-all standardized schooling environment as students. And that's what I hear over and over again from the founders who I interview on my podcast is just these teachers grew frustrated with their creativity being constrained and their inability to really meet children where they knew they needed to meet them because of top-down curriculum mandates and testing requirements and those other kind of bureaucratic constraints that they encountered in a conventional school.
Yep.
Both public and private, both conventional public and private schools have a lot of these constraints.
Well, of course, and we're running a little bit short on time here, so I want to give you just a couple of minutes here to close up with some final closing thoughts. But of course, I want to plug your book. Again, I think it's a fantastic book, especially for those parents out there who may be thinking alternative education might be what we need, and we need to see what our options are. And I think your book is a great place to start. Of course, I would also refer people to a book that came to mind while you were speaking earlier, Dumbing Us Down by John Taylor Gatto, who was, of course, he was a long-term school teacher who escaped the traditional schooling model, and I think had the sort of same epiphany that so many teachers, parents, and children are having with these fantastic options that are available to them and just may not know that they're available to them. So with that being said, Carrie, I want to give you just a couple of minutes here to close up. What other resources would you point people to, and what other thoughts do you have here in closing?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up John Taylor Gatto and his book. Of course, he was the longtime educator, like you said, state teacher of the year in New York, who famously in 1991 quit his job on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, saying he could no longer hurt kids to make a living, and was really talking a lot about what we've talked about today, just the ways in which conventional schooling can stifle curiosity and creativity. I cite his books in my book, Unschooled, but John Taylor Gatto's books are, you mentioned Dumbing Us Down. There's also Weapons of Mass Instruction, History of American Education. I'd encourage readers to look into all of those. Sadly, John Taylor Gatto passed away a couple of years ago, but his legacy certainly lives on and inspires those of us in the unconventional education space. You can also listen to my podcast and connect with me at the Foundation for Economic Education, which is one of the country's oldest free market think tanks, founded in 1946. And you can visit me there at fee.org/liberated.
I will link to those resources in the show notes so people can find those easily. And I'm going to put up here just real quickly. This is the article that I was referring to earlier at Fee. And of course, you can find Carrie's profile page by clicking on her name there. And then you can also coincidentally sign up for her Liberated newsletter at the bottom of that article. So I'll link to that article as well as her podcast. This is the page for the podcast about Indiana's massive micro school growth. So I'll certainly link to all of those. Well, Carrie, I really appreciate you taking the time to join the podcast. I hope that folks learned a little something from our discussion, and we'll go and look up your book and of course, listen to your podcast. Thanks again for joining the show.
Thanks, Alex. It's been great being here.
All right, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X. We're on X at Forge of Freedom, and you can also find our website at forgeoffreedom.com. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.